Well, good morning, Grace Church. Let me just start this morning. I just want to take a sip from my cup here. Look at that. Oh, hey. For those of you that don't know basketball, it was a game yesterday, and the Gators won, and they're now in the Final Four. Yeah. Can anyone... one thing I didn't catch yesterday in the midst of all the excitement, what time does Kentucky play today? Does anyone have a... All right, moving on. Hey, so when working at a company or a business, there's some things you shouldn't do, like diss your boss's team from the stage. Among those things are, you shouldn't eat somebody else's lunch in the fridge. You should always proofread your emails, and you should be especially important with this feature right here, reply all. Now, there's two ways we're victims of a reply all. The first way is we are the recipient of somebody hitting reply all, and we are now stuck in a loop of emails that aren't really meant for us. The other way we're a victim of a reply all is, we accidentally click it. And all of a sudden, a message that was intended for one person is now going to multiple people. Something that you only intended for one set of eyes to see is now being seen by, a few sets of eyes. But no matter what your reply all gaffe might have been, maybe you've messed up on this before, chances are you haven't messed up as bad as Vince. Let me tell you about Vince. So Vince was a guy working for the news company Reuters. When he wanted to email a few years ago the IT department to get his phone reactivated for work. So Vince sent an email, what he thought was an IT department, but ended up being all 33,000 employees that are a part of Reuters, asking for his phone to get reactivated. As you can imagine, this led to mass confusion of people replying all to that massive email. Is this meant for me? Why are you asking me this? Stop replying all. In total, over 7 hours that day, 23 million emails were exchanged back and forth to try to figure out this mess, and it shut down all communications inside the company. And I feel bad for Vince because I don't even know if his phone got reactivated. Poor guy, right? Can you imagine being in his shoes? A message that was meant for one person was now being seen by literally tens of thousands of people and beyond. But let's be real, this happens in life, and I'm not just talking about reply alls. Vince's problem was that something meant for one person or something meant to not be seen by many was seen by many. It was exposed, if you will. And sometimes our exposures are more consequential than just asking for our phones to get reactivated. Which begs the question, how does Jesus respond in light of our sin, our mistakes getting exposed? Which leads us to our next encounter that we're going to look at in this series, Beyond Belief. We've been in this series talking about God's unbelievable grace for some unlikely people. And so far we've seen an encounter with Jesus and a guy named Nicodemus and God's grace for the searching. We've seen an encounter with Jesus and a demon-possessed man who was afflicted and God's grace for those in pain. And last week, we saw Jesus' encounter with a bleeding woman and God's grace for the desperate. And today, we're going to look at another encounter. And this time, we're going to see God's grace for those who are exposed. And this encounter that we're going to look at, it involves Jesus and two other main characters, if you will. The first is a woman whose sin is exposed for all to see. And the other is the group of religious leaders, the Pharisees. And in the Gospel of John, in chapter 8, it sets the scene for us. And we get the context of the situation that's unfolding. Let's look at it here. At dawn, he, meaning Jesus, appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him. And he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group. So let's pause right here for a second. To paint the picture, you have to understand the temple courts. It was within the temple, and there was this big area where Jesus was standing and teaching others. The Pharisees drag a woman in and make her stand up in front of the group and publicly declare that this woman was caught in the act of adultery, that this was her sin. She was caught. Now, can you imagine that scene and how humiliating it must have been for the woman? Let's face it, nobody likes moments where they're caught, where their mistake becomes public for all to see, or at least for even one person to catch. We have lots of these moments of being caught in my house because I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. So you can imagine all the moments that happen. One that will always stand out for me was a couple Christmases ago. So it was Christmas Day, and this specific Christmas, we were hosting kind of 3 different gatherings at our house. We had one set of parents in the morning, another set in the afternoon, and another set at night. And so this is in between gatherings, and we're trying to flip our house over. And I noticed that my daughter Gemma, I hadn't seen her in a little bit. And so I looked around a couple rooms and didn't see her, and then I went in her room and I saw her. And she was doing something and quickly turned to me and tried to like put her hands behind her back. And I said, "Gem, what are you doing?" And she said, "Nothing." And I was like, "Well, no, what do you have?" And so I look and behind her, she's close to the wall, I see a beautiful drawing that she had made on the wall with her brand new set of markers that we got her for Christmas. It was really beautiful. It was like stick people and anyways. And so Gemma had never at this point drawn on the wall before. Like you know, there's that was just not her thing. And so I wish I could tell you I was calm, collected, very rational. But I lost it. I went, "Gemma, what are you doing?" And so I'm trying to like Gemma starts crying and she's like, "I just wanted to draw." I said, "There's paper for that." So then I'm trying to wash it off the wall. Gemma's crying, and Elisa's like, "What's going on?" We're both upset. It was a mess. And Gemma, she had this moment where she just felt so embarrassed by what she did, and she got caught. And what Gemma's story helps me realize is there are these moments for all of us where we're doing something and we make a mistake, whether it's intentional or not, and there's this moment where we get caught and we just feel the embarrassment. There's a lot of fear associated with that. But for some of us, it's more consequential than drawing on a wall. Some of us, it's family secrets that have been stuffed for generations. It's sexual immorality. It's shady business deals. It's lies upon lies upon lies that have snowballed. See, for some of us, our sin, our addictions even, that we try to keep covered up, we have a fear of what happens if they do come to light. And chief among those fears, what happens if those things come to light, is the fear of condemnation. What condemnation is basically the statement of you are guilty and suitable for punishment. And condemnation is even greater than a guilty verdict. What condemnation is a weight that's placed upon you. It's a shame, a deep shame that's associated with what you've done. Condemnation is basically your identity made up of what you've done and your sin. Because of the condemnation that we feel like we're going to get when our mistakes and sin come to light, it's why we try to do our best to not let exposure happen. It's why we try to do our best to keep things in the dark. It's why we go generations with that secret still in our family. It's why we tell lie after lie after lie to just cover things up. It's why we run from the law. It's why we try to mask our addiction. It's why we try to do all the things that we want to try to do to keep this hidden, to keep this in the dark and keep it a secret, so that way we don't have to face the condemnation that's going to come when it's brought into the light. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you are there right now. And this fear of condemnation is exactly what this woman was facing in that moment. Being brought up in front of a crowd, being caught in the act of adultery. Here's what the religious leaders said to Jesus and those listening. They said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" So the Pharisees are saying, hey, according to the law, this woman is to be stoned, be killed right there. And they pose a question to Jesus asking, what does he say about it? Because according to the law, it's over for this woman. Her sin is exposed and it's the end of the road. But what's interesting in the question that they pose, the religious leaders pose to Jesus, is we begin to get a more complete picture of this story. We see that it's not just the woman whose sin is being exposed in that moment, but it's actually also the sin of the Pharisees in this moment too. Because the author of the Gospel of John clarifies they're not just on a mission to seek justice and to figure out, make right this wrong. No, the Pharisees are actually there to do something more sinister. The author continues, the Pharisees, were trying to trap him, Jesus, into saying something they could use against him. This whole thing was a trap. It actually wasn't the woman on trial, it was Jesus. There were some red flags here to begin with. First of all, it says the woman was caught in the act of adultery, and it takes two to tango. So where is her partner? Well, not there. Because the Pharisees weren't quite interested in actually seeking justice for this sin. They wanted to use this woman as a tool to try to trap Jesus. And here was the trap. You might be like, well, where's the trap here? They were trying to paint a scenario and paint a picture where there was a lose-lose for Jesus. So if Jesus would have stood up there and said, yes, you should stone that woman, that's what the law says, he would have lost. The Pharisees would have pointed out that, well, Jesus, that doesn't sound like the grace and love that you've been talking about. And also, they would have raised conflict that Jesus was trying to stir things up with the Roman government. See, back then, Jews could not order executions to be made. That order had to come from Rome. So for Jesus to stand there and say, yes, you should stone this woman, get on with it, they would have trapped him and said, oh, look at you trying to use your power to go past Rome, bring it up that he's trying to be disobedient. But let's say Jesus didn't say you should stone her. Let's say he says you should not stone her. Don't do that. Where's the trap there? Well, then they would have said, oh, aren't you a Jewish rabbi? And you're going against the law of Moses as it's written. They would have tried to make him a disreputable teacher, an unfaithful Jew who doesn't know the law, who is going against the law of Moses. See, in the Pharisees' mind, this was a lose-lose they were trying to paint Jesus into, and they were trying to force condemnation on Jesus. Do you notice the irony here? You have a woman who's being paraded in front of a crowd in fear of condemnation, and you have a group of Pharisees and religious leaders who are hoping for condemnation. And that describes both sides of our lives in any given moment, doesn't it? See, some of our days we find ourselves like the woman, where our sin, our mistake is exposed, it's brought to light. And we find ourselves fearful of what condemnation is coming, what judgment is coming, and the consequences of that thereafter. Is this going to stick with us? Is it the end of the road for us like it seemed to be for the woman? But other times, we don't find ourselves in fear of condemnation. We find ourselves in hope of condemnation, dishing it out. And for me, if I'm kept unchecked, I can become a really good Pharisee. What about you? I like to sometimes notice other people's wrongs and be very quick to point it out. I like to think that I'm always right and dish out the truth. Or here's my own favorite. I like to sometimes look at other people's sin and go, well, thank goodness I don't do that. What about you? See, at the turn of a dime, we can all be really good Pharisees. We can all be really good at wanting to drop condemnation and seek condemnation for somebody else. But it begs the question, weren't the Pharisees right in their judgment? They said this is what it's written in the law. The law says she must be stoned. So wouldn't they be right in assessing that she should be stoned? And this is an important question for us to consider for a couple minutes. Because one theme that I'm seeing in our world today is that it's this belief that as long as what I say is right and it's the truth, I can say whatever, whenever, however I want. That as long as what I say is inherently right or truthful, then everything else goes out the window and I can just blah say it. I know this because I've been on Facebook. It's a scary place. So let's think about this question for a second. See, at the end of the day, by the letter of the law, by the reading of the law, the Pharisees were technically correct. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it reads that people, individuals that are caught in the act of adultery should be stoned to death. It wasn't their reading of the law that was wrong, though. It was their application of the law, which was problematic. Problematic in a few different ways. The first is they were being selective with the judgment they dropped. Remember, her partner wasn't there. So for the partner caught in the act of adultery, gets off clean, all good. Don't do it again. But for the woman, they were dropping judgment on her. They were being self-righteous with their condemnation. Once again, please don't make no mistake. They're not looking to actually seek justice here, the Pharisees. They're not looking to do that. They're looking to try to elevate themselves to look better and Jesus to look worse. Do you know why the Pharisees felt so threatened by Jesus? Because he was going to expose their sin and their hypocrisy. So what they had to do is they had to try to bring Jesus down to make themselves feel better. They were being self-righteous, and they were being merciless. At its core, what the purpose of the law was to bring people into repentance and lead them back to God. I mean, think about the origin of where the law comes from. The law came as a new way of living for Israel as they left their old life of slavery in Egypt and went to a new life of freedom through God. The law was to give them structure and to lead them back to living a life following God. At its core, that's what the law is for. The law is meant to bring people back to God, not meant to be this hashing and dropping judgment just to hurt someone. What am I getting at here? What I'm getting at is that in this moment, it's not just the sin of the woman that's exposed, it's the sin of the Pharisees as well. And hearts that are wanting to bring condemnation on this woman. Yes, the woman was fearful of it, but the Pharisees were sinful in the way that they wanted to bring condemnation and give condemnation. And I want to invite us to use this story as a lesson and a caution for us. I'm using it for myself, and I want to invite you to use it too. It's a caution for you. That if we're not careful, if left unchecked, we can easily turn into a Pharisee and want to bring condemnation onto a person or a group of people. And before we're too quick to bring condemnation, too quick to bring judgment, there's a few questions that I'm trying to ask myself in light of this story. I want to share them with you. The first is, am I being consistent? Am I not like the Pharisees, having one set of standards for someone else and another set of standards for another person? Am I being consistent in what I see a sin to be and to voice that and to say that? Am I seeking redemption for someone? Am I actually going to, if I have a conversation with someone about it, am I going to do this so that I can see them bring back to repentance and go back to God? Or am I doing this just to see them be hurt or make myself look better? And then am I showing compassion? At the end of the day, am I viewing that person as, like me, a human that struggles with sin? Or am I viewing them as a problem or something else? At the end of the day, when the roles are reversed, when we're not the Pharisees but we're the woman, don't we want these three things for us? Wouldn't we want the person viewing us in judgment to be consistent, to seek redemption for us, and to view us with compassion? If we want it for us in times where our sin is exposed, we have to offer it to others too in the midst of their sin and their exposure. So Jesus, faced with a trap, faced with a woman whose sin is exposed, faced with the Pharisees who now are exposing their hearts of sin, wanting to bring condemnation, what would he do? What would he say? Here's how he responds. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Jesus' first response, I love this, is to literally stoop down and start writing on the ground. Which of course leads to the question, what was he writing? What was he drawing? What was he doing? And the truth is, we don't know. This is an unsolved mystery. Growing up, one of my favorite TV shows, like when I was homesick for the day, it's like you'd watch Price is Right, and after that was over, I would watch Unsolved Mysteries. It's one of my favorite shows. If you never watched it, it's like it would walk through this drama of something that happened in a town far away, and then the ending would be unresolved. You wouldn't know what actually happened. And every episode, the narrator at the very end would ask all these questions, like did they flee, or are they hiding somewhere? They'd ask all these questions of possible outcomes, and then the narrator would go, someone somewhere knows the truth. And I think this, this situation, I would label it as a heavenly unsolved mystery, where only Jesus and those there actually know the truth. Because listen, I've heard a lot of really great sermons about what Jesus wrote in the dirt. Maybe you have too, right? But the reality is we don't know. Did Jesus write down the sins of all those standing there? Did he write down the 10 Commandments? Did he write down a truth about bearing false witness? Did he draw the Florida Gator logo in the sand? I don't know. I don't know. We don't know. It's an unsolved mystery. I'll add that to the top of my list to ask Jesus when I get to heaven, okay? I'll find out. We don't know what he wrote, but we do know what he said. And here's what he said. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, here's what's so fascinating about his response here. He doesn't respond either way for the Pharisees to really ding him. Remember their plan? Like, you shouldn't stone her or you should stone her? Well, he doesn't really respond either way. He doesn't completely say, hey guys, don't do that, stop. But he also doesn't say, all right, pick up your rock and let it go. He says, let any one of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. This response is fascinating because it's also not a clearance. Jesus isn't trying to say, hey, only perfect people can throw stones. He kind of is, but he also isn't. This isn't just about their history of sin. It's also about their heart in that moment. Meaning, Jesus saying, if you are right now without sin in your heart, go ahead and toss that stone. Jesus had this ultimate flip the script moment, didn't he? The Pharisees intended to trap him, but he flips the script and, tells them something different. What the Pharisees discover in that moment is judging is a double-edged sword. See, when we want to judge others, we in turn judge ourselves as well. You know the phrase, where there's one finger pointing at others, there's what? 3 more pointing back at you? Well, the Pharisees discovered that firsthand. And Jesus talked a lot about this idea, about judging others and not examining yourself. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is recorded by saying this. It says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is exactly what the Pharisees were experiencing here. What they discovered is they have to examine themselves first before trying to judge others. This is exactly what Jesus was talking about. And so what we see is that slowly, the Pharisees, at least in that moment, heard what Jesus was saying, and they actually respond. Here's what happens. At this, the Pharisees who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Isn't that fascinating? The older ones, probably those who had lived a little more life, had a little more sin, I would imagine, to go back on their record, walked away. I imagine they had having rocks in their hands or just kind of throwing the rocks on the ground and walking away. Until one by one they're gone, and only Jesus is standing there with the woman. It was the ultimate flip the script moment. But now's the moment of truth for the woman, isn't it? Her being exposed in her sin, caught in the act of adultery, what would Jesus say to her? Here's how it concludes. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." This woman who feared condemnation, feared the judgment that was going to come down, feared possibly the end of her life in that moment, was given a gift from Jesus. Really, two gifts, if you want to put it this way. What did Jesus give this woman? He gave her grace and truth. See, grace is God's unmerited favor toward us. And truth is God's unwavering direction for us. We have grace, which is God's love for us, but also truth, which tells us how then we should live and how then we should grow. And what Jesus did beautifully in his life is perfectly model a balance of grace and truth. In fact, in the beginning, in the introduction of the Gospel of John, which is a beautiful poetic intro, and it sets a lot of themes that were going to be present throughout the gospel. There's a beautiful picture of who Jesus is when it comes to grace and truth. It says this. It says, the Word became flesh. Jesus became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We call it the incarnation. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of what? Grace and truth. He was full of grace and truth. He didn't come favoring one and not the other or swinging back and forth between both. Jesus brought grace and truth fully in all ways to all people in all things. To help us get a focus for this of what Jesus did, I want to take us back to the old childhood tale, one of my favorites, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So we know the story, right? Goldilocks, she eats the porridge, she lays in the beds, she sits in the chairs, and she's looking for the ones that are what? Just right. Not too hot, not too cold. Not too hard, not too soft. She's looking for the ones that are just right. And what Jesus does and what he embodies in his example of is a just right grace and truth. Because when things get sideways, disaster happens when it's all one and not the other. So when we're all truth and no grace, we become harsh, judgmental, really quick to condemn. We begin to draw lines, hold stones like the Pharisees, and maybe we forget that we're even sinners too. All truth, no grace doesn't work. But what also doesn't work is all grace and no truth. All grace and no truth, it makes us, quite honestly, soft of recognizing and naming sin. We're hesitant to call out what's wrong. We're even maybe confused about what God actually asks of us. See, when we're all grace, no truth, that doesn't quite work either. Neither option works. And what works is the beautiful, just right, fully balance of grace and truth. And it's exactly what Jesus offers this woman. Notice what he tells her first. He says, has no one condemned you? He says, then neither do I condemn you. AKA that punishment that was on the table, being stoned, it's there no longer. But notice he doesn't end there. He doesn't say, hey, you're good, go ahead, be gone. He also then tells her truth. Go now and leave your life of sin. He meets her with grace, right where she's at in the midst of her sin. But he speaks truth to her about where she needs to go from there. The reality is she needs to leave her life of sin. The order matters too on this. Grace meets us where we're at. God's grace meets us where we're at in the midst of our sin, but truth doesn't leave us there. Truth tells us how we need to grow and where we need to go from there. And what we see is this beautiful, just right blend of grace and truth. And what Jesus gave to the woman and also even gave to the Pharisees of grace and truth that he gave to them, it's what he gives to us today too. That instead of condemnation, Jesus offers me grace and truth in response to my sin. When our sin, when that thing comes to light, when the lie unravels, when the addiction's exposed, Jesus isn't waiting there with condemnation. He's waiting there with grace and truth. And this isn't just for us and ourselves, but it's for others too. I discovered that a couple years ago on Christmas Day. So after I lost my mind and I'm trying to scrub the wall and, I have Gemma drawing on it, it finally all clicked in a moment. And I had that moment of, what am I doing to this poor girl? This girl who's just excited to play with her markers. So I had this moment of conviction where I went back and I said, Gemma, I am so sorry. I'm not going to ask for an apology from you first. I'm going to give an apology to you, and I'm so sorry. I should not have yelled at you. That was wrong. I know you're excited. Gemma was still kind of crying, and she hugged me and she said, it's okay. And she said, I'm sorry for coloring on the wall. And then we had a conversation about truth afterward, if you need to grab a piece of paper and not color on the wall. But in that moment, it was a beautiful example of what this looks like. Not only for myself, but what I needed to offer to Gemma. I needed to meet her with grace first. And then tell her the truth. She's a child. She needs to learn these things. There's necessary truth that she needs in order to grow, in order to know what to do and what not to do. I needed to offer her grace and her truth. And guess what? God convicted me too. I didn't go to Gemma feeling shameful. I went to her knowing, and convicted, rightfully so, that God's going to teach me something through this. So friends, where are you in the story? Are you the woman? Fearful of condemnation? Your sin is known, it's out there, and you're just waiting to see what happens next. You're waiting to see what stones are thrown at you. Maybe you're even throwing stones at yourself. I want to invite you to hear the good news of Jesus. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. I want you to hear a Savior that shows you grace and not condemnation today. Or are you the Pharisees in this story? Can you say that today you came into worship holding a rock or two, ready to throw it at somebody or a group of somebodies? I want to invite you to hear the grace and truth that Jesus offers the Pharisees, that let those of you without sin cast the first stone. And maybe today, to hear the words of Jesus and drop the rock and let him soften your heart. Drop pride and pick up humility. Drop self-righteousness and pick up righteousness that comes from him. No matter who you are in the story, no matter if you're fearful of condemnation or you're wanting to give condemnation, know that Jesus responds to your sin with grace and truth. And I hope that you experience that for yourself today. Let's stand for prayer. God, we're thankful for your son, Jesus. We're thankful that he came to this earth full of grace and truth. God, may we, as followers of his, mirror that in our lives as well. God, some of us, we need this grace and truth because we are the woman in this story. Our sin known, exposed, unraveled. God, we're fearful of the condemnation that awaits us. And Lord, I pray that for those of us that we would hear this word, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. God, let us have a new start because of the grace and truth that you give us. God, others of us, we're the Pharisees today. And we've come into this place holding a rock or two. God, by your grace and truth, would you help us to let go of the rocks and drop them and to look toward you instead? God, thank you that no matter where we're at, fearful of condemnation or wanting to bring condemnation, that you show us grace and truth. Lord, lead us now, guide us now as we encounter you just like those in this story. Lord, it's in your name we pray. Amen. Friends, I want to invite you. We're going to sing a song together to close in worship. Maybe you want to come up here and pray. You can do that. You can kneel at the altar. If you want someone to pray with you, you can lift a hand. You can make your seat a place of prayer as well. But let's sing, let's worship together, let's pray together.